Hello and welcome to another episode of The Word for Kids. I'm Jaymie and I'm guiding you through the book of Genesis in a series of 20 episodes. We've been talking about Joseph, who was sold by his brothers and ended up in a prison in Egypt. He was put in charge of looking after two of Pharaoh's men, his cupbearer and his baker, who were put in prison after offending Pharaoh. Both men had strange dreams and didn't know what they meant. Joseph interpreted the dreams and what he said came true for both of them. Joseph asked the cupbearer to talk to the Pharaoh when he returned to him about releasing him from prison, but the cupbearer did not do that. Let's find out what happened next. Are you ready for today's adventure? Let's go. Two years later, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, which is a big river that runs through Egypt. Out of the river came up 7 cows that were sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them came up 7 other cows that were ugly and gaunt. This just means they looked very hungry and unhealthy. The ugly cows ate the fat cows. And that's when Pharaoh woke up. Ew, what a strange dream. Next, Pharaoh fell asleep and had another dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted. They were thin and scorched. The thin and scorched heads of grain swallowed up the healthy grain. Wow, that's a strange dream too. Pharaoh was troubled by his dreams the next morning, so he called for all the magicians and wise men in Egypt, but no one knew what the dreams meant. It was then that the cupbearer remembered what Joseph had done. He spoke up and said, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings." He went on to tell Pharaoh about his time imprisoned in the house of the captain of the guard with the chief baker. He told Pharaoh of the dreams he and the baker had, and that a young Hebrew servant listened to their dreams and interpreted them. Of course, as we learned last week, things happened exactly as Joseph, the young Hebrew, had told them. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. He shaved and changed his clothes and came before the king. Pharaoh said, "I had a dream, but no one can interpret it. But I have heard that you can interpret a dream when you hear it." Joseph told Pharaoh it was God who would give him the answer he desired. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams about the sickly cows eating the healthy cows and the scorched grain eating the healthy grain. Joseph told Pharaoh these 2 dreams were one and the same, and God revealed to Pharaoh what he was about to do. The 7 fat cows and 7 good heads of grain meant there would be 7 years of abundance. Oh, that sound means it's time for the word of the day.
Abundance, more than enough, a lot, abundance.
So the 7 healthy cows and heads of grain meant 7 years of abundance, but the 7 ugly cows and thin grain meant there would be 7 years of famine, which means there would not be enough food for the people. There were 2 dreams because God had decided the matter firmly and would do it soon. Joseph went on to tell the Pharaoh that he should put a discerning and wise man in charge and appoint commissioners to take 1/5 of the grain during the 7 years of abundance and then use that stored up grain during the 7 years of famine so that the country would not be ruined. Well, as it turns out, Pharaoh really liked Joseph's plan. He liked it so much he put him in charge. He said, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace and everyone will submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be higher than you." Suddenly, Joseph went from being an imprisoned servant to being in charge of all of Egypt. Wow! Pharaoh gave Joseph his signet ring right off his own finger, as well as robes made of fine linen and a gold chain. He also gave Joseph a wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the Pharaoh's service. So Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, collecting grain and storing it in the store cities as he had planned. He stopped keeping records of the stored grain because it was beyond measure, abundant, huge amounts of grain. In the meantime, Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Then the 7 years of abundance ended, and the famine began just as Joseph said it would. The people began to cry out to Pharaoh because they did not have enough food. But guess what? Joseph had planned all along for this. So Pharaoh told the people to go to Joseph and do whatever he said. And thanks to Joseph, Egypt survived. The surrounding countries also had severe famine, and Joseph had stored up so much that he was even able to sell grain to the surrounding countries. All the world came to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was so severe. And that's where our story ends for today. I'm so excited to share with you next time how God worked all these things together for Joseph and his family. But for now, it's time for the verse to remember. This week's verse is from Genesis 41:16. This is right after Pharaoh asked Joseph to interpret his dreams. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. One more time. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. This week's challenge is to think about what gifts God has given you. In the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 4, the Bible says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. We just learned about how Joseph used his gifts, the ability to interpret dreams, as well as wisdom to plan for the future, to save an entire nation from famine. If you're a kid, you may still be learning about what your gifts are and developing them, but it's never too early to start using those gifts God has given you to serve others. Maybe you're really good at teaching others new things. Maybe you can sing beautifully. Maybe your gift is empathy, which means it's natural for you to think about how others feel and what they need. Whatever your gifts are, remember to thank God for giving them to you and think of ways to use that gift for good. You never know. Maybe someday God will use you to save someone else. That's all the time we have for this episode. I can't wait to see you again next time for another episode of The Word for Kids.